In what ways the situation in Ukraine can influence the situation for Syria and Iran? Oh, that's very interesting. Well, to know that, we need to understand how all parties are linked with each other. So, who stands with who in Ukraine? Who stands with Russia? How are the situations? And it can be very confusing, by the way. And let me tell you why. Number one, let's start with Iran. Iran, a close ally of Russia, their strategic relationship with Russia has increased tremendously to a level where it reached their new strategic agreement. That was anything, it was just shy of declaring a defense pact. I mean, its contents included things that can easily be interpreted as a defense pact, but it was more thorough, more inclusive in other aspects to a defense pact, because it included things to do with governance, to do with the judiciary, to do with economy, and to do with security and defense and strategic military partnership. And that has been evident in the past, during the genocide in Gaza, of course, but before that, Iranian support for Russia in Ukraine, the drones, Russia returning the favor by sending them strategic weapons, strategic missiles. Reports confirmed from Iran that they have not only their own advanced air defense systems, but also Russian air defense systems, Russian equipment, Russian arms, and Russian radars, and the Su-35. There was a confirmation. It was in Iran. So all of that signals that Iran and Russia are strategic allies, including, of course, China. But let's talk about Russia and Iran, because the question is revolving about Russia and Iran. So undeniably, Russia is with Iran and Iran is with Russia. And that hasn't been the case before, by the way. Russia, as a matter of fact, was taking a position more towards Western interest in Iran before. People need to understand that at the beginning of the 2000s, that wasn't the case between Iran and Russia. However, these things developed. The more time went by and the more these two countries dealt with the arrogant US administration, Western administrations, and understanding their neo-colonialist nature and how they want to have this hegemony and control and dictate everything that other nations do. And both Russia and Iran have self-respect. Moving on to Syria and Russia and Ukraine. Before the collapse of Bashar al-Assad and after the collapse of Bashar al-Assad. Okay. So before the collapse of Bashar al-Assad, anyone or anything who is pro-Iran or pro-Russia from the main parties involved in the Syrian opposition was someone they constantly curse. They didn't care what they did for Palestine. They didn't look at, many of them didn't look at the greater geopolitical view. All they cared about is what Russia and Iran were doing in Syria. To them, they were cursing Iran and cursing Iran, cursing Russia, the Syrian opposition before the collapse of al-Assad. So they supported Ukraine. Some of them showed signs of support for Israel, some elements of them, to be very fair. Then anything to do with Russia being attacked or Iran being attacked was something that some elements in the Syrian opposition before celebrated. How is that now? And what's the situation like now? Well, clearly after the collapse of al-Assad, the way his government collapsed, the fact that the army retreated, the fact that Russia and Iran did not go in and support them, neither did Hezbollah, because they found out certain things and because they had clearly some coordination with the main parties involved, including Turkey and Russia. Turkey is, of course, a big player in Syria, and Russia too. Now, what people need to know also is that Syria, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and the Syrian opposition, so the previous Syrian administration, the Syrian opposition, Iran, Turkey, and Russia, they had a committee following the Astana understandings. The opposition, Al-Julani, HTS, Al-Shara, previously HTS, now the Syrian country, they had controlled parts of Idlib, and they were looking to have a deal with Bashar al-Assad. So time went by. The Russians and the Turks, they spoke with al-Assad. They told him, look, let's get this resolved before something happens. Because al-Assad and Iran knew that HTS at the time were preparing an offensive. But al-Assad denied, he was in denial of things going to happen. But all of a sudden we had this operation. When it began, Iran, Russia, and Turkey sat down together. Turkey told them, this is the situation. Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia decided not to participate and not to help Bashar al-Assad. Then things went ahead. No conflict between Iran and the Hezbollah or Russia. As a matter of fact, when the Syrian armed opposition forces reached Iranian-controlled bases, no one there, they allowed them safe exit. When they saw Hezbollah, they actually had communication with them. When they went to Latakia, they were next to the Russian bases, and nothing happened in terms of clashes. So what exactly happened? Your enemies of yesterday, all of a sudden, you are not attacking them, they're not attacking you. What does all of that indicate? That there was a deal. There was an understanding. If you can't see that, then you're delusional. Some people like to interpret things in a very way, looking at it from like a shell perspective, like a very tiny scope, tiny lens. But things were clearly more thorough than that. What is Syria's position? So Syria, in terms of Assad before, of course, Russia was there. Syria now, who were opposing Russia because of its support for al-Assad, which stopped and allowed this takeover from the opposition to Syria. What is the situation like with Russia now? Well, look at what happened. What happened? Russia, they have al-Assad with them, right? And his family. After his collapse, they were from the first countries who raised the new Syrian flag in the Syrian embassy, saying that, we're willing to talk. Then hear what the new administration in Syria are saying about Iran. They said, we don't mind having strategic relationship with Iran so long as they don't interfere in the internal matters of Syria. What about Russia? We don't mind. We would like to have strategic relations with Russia based on friendly coordination. What happened recently? Senior members of the government in Syria were in talks with Russia, with the Russian administration, to find a deal where Russia will keep its bases in Latakia and Tartus, which are considered to be very strategic bases, in exchange for potentially some sort of a compensation or support for the new administration. What do we understand from all of this? We understand a couple of things. That things are not as black and white as some try to portray them to be. There has been a massive shift from the previous or certain previous elements in the armed opposition and what is now the new Syria. 3, the relationship with Russia primarily, who was the biggest country that protected al-Assad. Let's be frank, their role was bigger than the Iranian role. Although the Iranians played a very big role on the ground in opposing anyone who threatens al-Assad, like was with Hezbollah, and they were criticized heavily for them. And by the way, that didn't happen without internal criticism. Elements from Hezbollah and elements from Iran did not agree with the moves that both of them did in Syria. People need to understand that. The previous Iranian president, MahmoudOD, said that Damascus is run by a dictator in reference to Bashar al-Assad. And people need to understand that there were 3 years before Iran started to take decisive measures in Syria. However, who helped al-Assad remain? Who participated greatly to protect him? And when they participated, they kept him in. It was Russia. Because Russian Air Force, the bases, at aerial attack, they can bombard everything. Did they do that now with the takeover of the Syrian opposition? No. Why? Ask yourself why. Because clearly there were understandings about interests, about bigger interests, because what happens in Syria is never detached from regional players. You can forget about it. What happens in Syria and also what happens in Lebanon is not detached from key geopolitical progresses on a regional scale and on an international scale too. We saw what Gaza did to the whole world. What happened in Gaza is leading to all of these changes. There's an argument that if it wasn't for Al-Aqsa flood, those changes would have happened in Syria too. So the Syrian side, they're not closing the door. As a matter of fact, they're opening the door for Russia. Now they're seeing an administration in the United States who is more in favor of ending the war at the expense of taking even a more hostile position towards who? Towards the man who they were supporting with hundreds of billions for the past 5 years, Zelensky. Donald Trump is calling him a dictator. Donald Trump is telling him debt, return the money, to a level where we had a feud with the French president in the US when they had a row together. The French president was saying, like, no, we didn't give them that money as a loan. We don't want the money back. And after Trump had these statements, what happens on the ground in Ukraine? Russia feels much more confident. Russia's feeling much more confident to intensify its attacks against Ukraine because they know that these attacks, combined with the enormous political pressure of Donald Trump and his new position, which is a 180 U-turn from the previous Biden administration in Ukraine, it turned everything upside down. So all of that is indicating that, number one, whatever the new US administration say, their actions on the ground are showing that they are moving towards a resolution. Look at Ukraine. Ukraine is, for Europe, from a European perspective, and Europe are the biggest allies of the United States. It's detrimental. Now countries in Europe are considering sending troops to Ukraine. There are calls for a united European army without any link with the United States, because they've realized now their stupid positions against Russia that were led by the United States, they can end in one day just because the United States changed ways, shifted positions, even sides. There's an argument. And don't forget, by the way, how all of that is related to, well, the reports that confirm that Russia and Putin, they have something on Donald Trump. These things were circulating heavily before Donald Trump was elected in 2016. So there's no surprise that he's now taking these positions, because Donald Trump did nothing to harm Russia. Now, well, at least comparable to other administrations, or in particular Biden, who had interests in Ukraine alongside his son, alongside, of course, other congressmen, other politicians. So one of the biggest money laundering schemes in the world and one of the biggest frauds. Zelensky himself is saying about 90% of them, half of the money, it can't be traced. What do you mean it can't be traced? This is taxpayers' money from the populations, and I don't want to start talking about the populations who were supporting this, who supported this and sent you that money. That's not the government's money. That's the taxpayers' money. This is what people need to understand. The 500 billion that went to Ukraine is your hard-earned work that the government took from you in the form of taxation and went and put it in the pockets of the leader of one of the most corrupt regimes in Europe. Confirmations coming from Ukraine that much of the weapons, a lot of the money gets out of the Ukraine. Some of the weapon that they get in aid is sold to other countries. What's that? People, did you see the forced conscription of Ukrainians in the streets to levels where people buy silicone masks to try and escape and pretend like they're elderly? People getting killed over it. Millions of dead from the younger generations for the financial greed ugly financial greed of the United States and its Western allies in Ukraine. What is it for apart from that? A massive support for this militaristic oligarchy and the military industrial complex, corporations and corrupt politicians. What is it about? And now they're doing a U-turn, and that's it. You're going to have a resolution. What did these people die for then? What did these volunteers die for who were recruited from Western capitals, including London and other parts too? Trying to spread all of this propaganda that this is the war and this is and we need to protect Europe. Harming the people, the populations as well, by the way, too. We're not even talking about the economic disaster. The hikes in prices, in energy prices, where did that come from? What did the country compensate the population for their stupid decisions before they took all of these hostile decisions to a level where they stopped having any leverage against Russia, no leverage whatsoever? All of that indicates that the United States is looking towards a resolution. That will reflect in Syria, and that is looking like it's being reflected in Gaza and in Lebanon too. How? In Syria, he said, I'm not going to keep them in. Showed no objection for what Erdogan is doing. Turkey, in defiance of the United States, they're constantly getting more and more territories from the SDF, who are the main challenge. SDF are retreating, taking a step back, and even showing willingness to participate in the country, signaling that there will be a unity in Syria, unlike the doom and gloom prophets who are constantly spewing propaganda about Syria now. Then in Gaza, well, like I said, Netanyahu is saying something, and and Trump is saying something, but on the ground, they're progressing with all of the breaches. Likewise in Lebanon, withdrawal, they remained in a couple of parts too. But there is one thing remaining here. That one thing is Israel. Israel, this Western experiment in Palestine, intended to be an entity that only causes disruption and chaos to continue the conflict in the region for colonial purposes, for financial purposes, for military industrial complex purposes, for potentially energy exportation purposes in the future. All of that, they're using that front, that experiment, to bark and potentially kill itself in the process. I mean, definitely killing itself in the process, including killing its population in the process for this experiment. And the population in Israel, they're buying it, as you know. Of course, yeah, we will. We're God's chosen people, and this is biblical. And all of these fantasies and pseudo history and all of the propaganda that they're fed from a very young age. So that continues to be a problem. So it doesn't matter how much of a de-escalation we have, and it looks like by these progresses that we do have a de-escalation, there will be a problem. And what's that problem? That problem is Israel. So long as they exist as they are, they're a problem. Always will be. And if they collapse, listen to that, if they collapse, and the United States is already preparing for Israel to collapse, they've been preparing for Israel to collapse from a while ago. Look for the problems that are going to come from the United States. However, once Israel is down, it's going to be the final blow for the Western colonial establishment in the Western Asian region, or what's called the Middle East. It would be very difficult for them to have a foothold again. And we could potentially not be talking about like something so big and massive and with many casualties. It will be fear driving them out, by the way.